Today's webinar is presented by the Knowledge Mobilization team of Global Water Futures as part of our Knowledge Mobilization webinar series. We had our first webinar last month, and we have our next official one scheduled in February, but keep in touch because we may schedule a surprise webinar in January as well. We're working on that. So before we get started, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping topics. Today's webinar is being recorded. We'll be able to share a link with you after the event is complete. Give us a day or two because it's a little bit tricky. We're still figuring out how to convert the file into a YouTube file, but we will share those once they're done and ready. We're going to invite you at that time to re-watch the webinar or to share with your colleagues as you see fit. We're going to also invite comments and questions throughout the webinar. So if you take a look in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a chat box. You can either send your questions to everyone or you can send them to one of us specifically. If you think you have a question for any of our speakers at any point in time, just please feel free to include that in the chat box. We're also going to open up the lines a number of times throughout the webinar to get your input or to do so through the polling for those people who might be a little more shy. We're going to try to make lots of opportunities for engagement. Like I had said earlier, please mute your lines if you have not done so already. That's going to reduce background noise. So your presenters for today are Andrew Springs, he's the Knowledge Mobilization Specialist at Wilfrid Laurier University, and myself, Nancy Gaucher from the University of Waterloo. We also have Stephanie Merrill on the line as well. She's the Knowledge Mobilization Specialist at University of Saskatchewan. And for those who might be joining us from McMaster University, Stephanie Morningstar is the KM person there, although she is away at this time, was not able to join the webinar. So we'll move on. Not everyone on our webinar is part of Global Water Futures, so I'll just do a really quick intro of Global Water Futures. This is a pan-Canadian water research network. We were granted $78 million over 7 years from the Canadian First Research Council. Oh my gosh, how come I'm forgetting that acronym? CFREP, the Canadian First Research Excellence Fund. There we go. It's quite a large network. We have 152 researchers at 15 universities and over 350 Canadian and international partners. So it's quite a big effort. What we're really essentially doing is looking for risk management solutions for water futures in Canada. We're trying to anticipate what's going to happen with climate change and how do we make sure that we're still managing our resources adequately. We have over 42 diverse research projects, which are listed on the next slide. And 12 of those are very specific to creating solutions with end users. They were defined in a way that is supposed to be about working with the end user, what are their questions, and then providing solutions that are very specific to that. And most recently, we've also added 8 specific projects that are working with Indigenous communities. So the next slide describes our approach and the importance of knowledge mobilization in Global Water Futures. It's a core principle of the entire program. And then, like I had said, this is specifically for the end-user-driven projects, but actually applies across the board to all of the Global Water Futures funded projects. And because knowledge mobilization is such a critical part, we've actually hired core staff to support that additional work. And I had already introduced the core staff at the beginning of the webinar. I think what's really critical at this point is just to mention that, you know, all of our research is really about finding out how do we protect and manage our water resources. And this is all very central to the things that we care about as researchers. And so knowledge mobilization is about that piece of this. how do we actually get all of the smart things that you guys and our researchers are coming up with and make sure that that information is delivered to the end user so that it can be picked up and utilized and actually used to protect the water resources. So, it's really important. We're not just researching for research sake, but actually trying to improve what's happening in the real world. So that's part of this KM webinar series, and I'll pass this off to my colleague Andrew to take us through this piece.
Okay, thanks, Nancy. Am I showing up? I don't see myself. Anyway, hi everyone. Welcome from snowy Waterloo. Usually we don't introduce that, but we're getting some winter down here early. So the KM webinar series, we kind of created this, the core team created this session really because we tend to focus on our own projects and our own KM. But there's a lot of knowledge out through the network, right? There's a lot of great things going on in different projects, and we really wanted to create that forum that we could all come together and share, learn from some experts, learn from each other, and really start that discussion and troubleshoot some of our common challenges across the network. So the webinar series, really it's for the GWF network. We've really intended this to be focused on HQP or students, but anyone really is invited to attend and be a part of it. Even someone, even outside our network, I think we've got some people not within the GWF family attending. Next slide, please. And yeah. So what we hope to do is really increase awareness and value of KM across the network, share some examples of what KM looks like in action across some of our projects and across the network, and really build a community of practice to identify and discuss and troubleshoot common practices. We have a list of webinars on the website, but in the spirit of participation, we always want to hear from you to know what other KM subjects you're interested in, or what other topics we could have this discussion with. Okay, this was always meant to be a forum to learn a little, to share a lot. So it'd be really great if we could get some input from our projects and our network members to guide some of the discussion moving forward.
Great. And Stephanie Merrill and I hosted the first webinar. And the way that we had organized the session was we included a number of tips for making your research happen through knowledge mobilization, which are listed here on the screen. And we also interspersed those tips with stories about how we've actually done knowledge mobilization. We're going to continue along the same lines for this webinar as well. But we just wanted to quickly recap some of the main points we learned from the last webinar. What KM is really about being opportunistic. Success isn't very straightforward. It's not like we can give you a list of boxes to check, and then you check those 5 things, and then you've done knowledge mobilization. It's a little trickier than that, and sometimes it's more about sort of pushing as many doors as you can, finding which ones open, and ensuring that you're taking advantage of those opportunities. But at the same time, we also talked about the need to plan for a little bit of success and to try to identify and plan for those opportunities, create those opportunities yourself. And we're going to continue talking about some of those things, specifically related to stakeholder management, because stakeholder management is such a critical part of knowledge mobilization. And we're going to send out a survey at the end of this webinar asking for your feedback. One of the pieces of feedback we got from the last webinar is that people wanted to learn more about the nuts and bolts of stakeholder engagement. So ta-da, that's what we're going to talk about today. So we do listen to you, and we encourage you to provide further feedback. So on our next slide, we presented this diagram as a way to explain that knowledge mobilization is about trying to achieve impact. And impact is really defined very broadly. It might be a policy change. It might be changing the behavior of a community. It might be changing a technical process. But in order to achieve the impact, you need to define your research question with your end users, ideally as depicted. You need to figure out how to best communicate your results. And then finally, you need to understand the context in which your research applies. And part of that I mean, that's a very difficult thing to try to figure out that context because that's not where researchers live. You know, researchers are living in the labs, researchers are living in their computer models, they're living in the journals that they're reading. So it's very difficult to understand what's happening in the context of the end users unless you actually identify those end users and start building relationships with them. So we'll dive into some of those concepts in a minute.
Right. So a lot of the work that we're going to be focusing on today is really the nuts and bolts of building those relationships, right? Some of it can actually work through our research. CIHR, which is another one of those tri-council funding agencies, has this kind of background to what they call integrated knowledge transfer. And it's based on these principles of participatory research. You know, as a social scientist in my background, participatory research is kind of ingrained in everything we do when we work with communities. It's not often a concept in the natural sciences. And so knowledge mobilization is often kind of bridging that gap between the science that you do and the outreach and the engagement and the participatory actions that you can have to ensure that your knowledge is, I guess, mobilized or given to the right receiver in the way that they want to receive that information. But really, you know, participatory research fits on the spectrum, okay? You can have it so it's ingrained and weaved throughout your project. And of course, some projects will do this much better than others, perhaps. Or there's this kind of end of term or end of grant knowledge mobilization or knowledge transfer, where you go out and you do the research and then you do all the knowledge transfer when you have the results at the end. Okay, and both are valid, and sometimes it depends on who you're working with and what they want and how they want to be interacted with. But again, there's all these spectrums of how to engage and what your partners expect and really how they want to be engaged. And so a lot of the tips that we're going to talk about today really are going to touch on some of that. And again, CIHR and SHRC and all the tri-council agencies have a lot of principles and background information. And I think we've captured some of this on some of the knowledge mobilization resources that we have. I think we're going to try a poll question next. Here we go. So we really wanted to hear from all of you out there as to what degree that you think your project applies some of those participatory principles. You know, are you fully participatory, maybe somewhat, somewhere in the middle, or not participatory at all, right? Was your KM plan to go out and do your work and then talk to people at the end? Do you have, you know, we talked a lot about co-creation. Did that happen as part of your planning? You know, has your stakeholders been engaged all through the process? And really be honest, right? Like, we really want to see where everyone fits on this, and see how much effort or I guess action we need to push people along to get back into that spectrum of participation. Somewhat participatory. That's pretty awesome. I don't know if someone could highlight something in the chat box, perhaps, about maybe what makes that somewhat participatory. If you need to kind of share some of these stories about what people are doing to push you into that somewhat participatory spectrum. A KM advisory committee has come up. That's some of the projects do that too. That's pretty exciting stuff. It's interesting how sometimes KM is put on the shoulders of one person, and that advisory committee kind of spreads that out amongst many people. Direct regular communication, and we're going to get into that a little bit as well. But again, it depends on who your end user is, and if that works for them, that's awesome. Okay, do we want to move on to the next one? But I think this is really encouraging, everybody. It's nice to see that a lot of these things are already being incorporated, and that there's some good stories that we can share on the network.
Okay, so if we were going to move towards more of a participatory research approach and applying those principles, the very first thing to do would be to identify and understand your end users. So an end user is defined as an individual who is likely to be able to use research results and make informed decisions about water and their environmental policies. Could also be programs or practices. So some end users might be practitioners, they might be policymakers, educators, decision makers, water practitioners, community leaders, could be an individual in a charity, a private sector, or even a media outlet. So there's lots of different potential audiences that you might have for your research. An end user's level of engagement depends on the research that you're doing. So they might be engaged sort of at the end. They might actually have knowledge to contribute throughout in terms of defining the research question, the methodology, perhaps providing data. So it sort of depends, but different end users can be involved at different levels. So if you don't know who your end users are yet, the most important part is to actually start identifying them. And it means identifying not just the organization. So if your end user is defined as Environment and Climate Change Canada, that's not quite detailed enough. You need to actually start getting down to the level where you know the specific department or you know the specific area. So maybe if they're science or policy, or ideally you would actually have a name. You know, decisions are not made by organizations. Decisions are still made by people. And so if you are going to be able to influence an organization, you have to know who in the organization you're going to be talking to and influencing. So I do have a couple of links there included. If you don't know, you can go to GEDS, G-E-D-S, and that's a good directory for federal staff employees. You can either search by department and start working your way down. You can put in a name and find their phone number and email address, so it's a really handy resource. There's also one for the province of Ontario, InfoGo. I'm not sure if there's one for the other provinces, but I'm sure you could ask your supervisors, ask your KM specialists. That's what we're here for. Speaking of which, that's another good resource. If you don't know who your stakeholders are, you should be asking your supervisor, asking the PIs on your project, asking like I had said before, the KM specialists. We have really large networks of people that we work with, so we're great resources that I encourage you to tap into. The other thing to note is that the KM team has created a list of stakeholders that all of the Global Water Future projects work with. We have this big spreadsheet of all the partners, and if you are looking for, say that you know that you want to have a relationship with someone in the Six Nations Reserve, then you can come to us and say, who else might already have a relationship? And we can put you in touch with those people, those professors, or those other people who have that resources already. And they can be helpful. They might give you tips on how to approach that organization. They might tell you which person in that organization you can go to. And I think it also helps us just coordinate things a little bit better. We really don't want to overwhelm our stakeholders. And because of how large our GWF network is, it would be pretty bad form if we had 350 researchers going out and asking the same people in Environment Canada for information. So we're just trying to step back and coordinate that a little bit. So we encourage you to talk to your KM specialists if you're trying to build relationships with other people that might already have relationships with the researchers in GWF. Also think about your own history. You guys have, you know, whether or not you have built a large network with the specific research that you're doing right now, you might have people who are already networked. You could go to your friends, you could put a call out on Facebook, you could think about who you already know in past research or other positions in your life. So once you've identified who your stakeholders are, who your end users are, it's really important to understand a little bit about them. So for instance, how do they perceive the problem that you're trying to solve? Do they even see it as a problem? That's a really important question to start out with, because if they don't see it as a problem, then that's where you're going to need to start your conversation. Did you know that this is happening and this is why it matters? It's also important to understand what the barriers are to action. So if you think you've found a solution and you're like, this is really curious, why hasn't that already been implemented? It's really important to go and talk to your stakeholders and find out why. Is there a lack of political will? Is there a lack of money and resources? Is this new science that people just don't quite understand? You know, what's the hesitation behind that? And if you understand what the barriers are, then you're much more able to develop arguments to address those specific barriers and be able to push your idea further ahead. And finally, it's really about targeting your solution to the problems that, and in the way that your stakeholders perceive the problem. So that's sort of in general really important to understand how they see problems so that you can provide solutions that can be very specific. Okay, we have another poll here, but perhaps it's not working. I will, oh, it's close to working. The question is, we're going to ask you, how confident are you that you know who your stakeholders are for your project? So are you very confident that you know versus all the way down to not confident at all? I was doing this, I was doing a workshop earlier this week at Waterloo, and I asked some of the people in attendance how confident they were. I was a little bit surprised that people had not fully defined who their stakeholders were, but I just think that that's an opportunity for us to keep improving as we move forward. So I'm going to keep moving. We'll skip this poll. If you want to enter information into the chat box and give us some ideas in terms of how confident you are that you know who your stakeholders are, we'll do it that way. But I'll keep moving on so that we're not holding things up. So once you know who your stakeholders are, the next step is building a relationship with them. Probably not that much of a stretch to think that this is the next step. But you know, it's I thought long and hard about what kind of information to provide here. It's a little bit difficult to try to explain how do you build a relationship with people. In a lot of ways, it's the same thing as building a relationship with anybody. If you're identifying your shared goals and values, what you're really doing is finding what do you guys have in common. And you know, what's probably a positive aspect to this work, because we're all working on water, we already share something in common. We're all working towards improving water management, water protection, water quality, water quantity, water flows, whatever aspect of water we're working on. Other people share that same value, or ideally share that same value. But I think it's about taking it to the next level and really trying to understand what is it that you specifically share in common, and then what is your niche? So how can you add more value? Which sort of refers to the fourth bullet here, is offering something valuable. You can't really expect something from someone if you're not willing to give something. So just as, and sort of in reverse, just as you have something valuable to offer, you have a new way of understanding things, you have data, you have models, you have results to share. Your end users and your stakeholders have things to offer as well. So in order to get something from them, you need to be able to give something. So for instance, if you're pulling together a survey and you want to survey some farmers and you're asking organizations to send that survey out to farmers, you might want to think about what can you give in return. So for instance, maybe you can provide the results of your survey, or perhaps you could leave room for a question on your survey that that organization might be able to help you formulate. So thinking about that. And I think that that also speaks to, these are all sort of interrelated. So developing mutual respect. I think it's about understanding, how do I explain mutual respect? I mean, I think if you're not demonstrating that you're willing to go the distance to develop the relationship yourself, then I think people are less willing to work with you. So for instance, one way to show mutual respect is going and visiting your stakeholders themselves. Going to them, to their office. I think that demonstrates a willingness to kind of go out of your way as well to get their information and get their knowledge. And meaningful connections, it's really important. These people are people, and one of the things that I've sort of done through my career is to try to really get to know people as well. So, understanding what's going on in their personal lives. I mean, don't get too personal, but I think it does help to develop relationships, and relationships mean getting to know people. So thinking about what is it the meaningful aspect of your relationship that you can get to without getting too personal. I mean, you have to kind of feel that out. And ask for what you want. So for instance, when I'm networking at an event, but this also applies to walking into a meeting, it's very helpful if you know exactly what you want. Because if you are not very clear and very specific, then your conversation sort of wanders all over the place. Maybe you never get to that place where you're figuring out what you want. So it's very helpful. So when I walk into a room and I'm networking, I know I sort of have a list in my head about what kind of conversations I'm starting with different people so that you can get to the point much more quickly. So we have another we're actually doing a word cloud here. Let's see if this one works. What we're going to ask you, so start thinking about these things. What are tips for building relationships with stakeholders? And ideally what we're looking for is you to either use one word or short little phrases. And you can, once again, use your browser, or you can text the words and phrases to this number. Oh, yeah, and they're starting to pop up.
Nancy, I was going to add something a little bit about, sometimes relationship building happens in those informal spaces, right? They don't always have to happen at a meeting. Sometimes it's at the coffee break or something like that, right? Where you get to still talk about the work you're doing, but just sometimes in a little bit of a different context. And it really just kind of creates that space for that understanding, right?
Very good point, yeah. Following through. That seems to be popping up a number of places. If I interpret that correctly, I'd assume that it means if you're going to promise something, promise data, that you're going to actually follow through and provide that information. I think being able to count on someone is also an element of respect. It's also an element of mutual, building trust as well. These are great comments.
Yeah, this is going to be a good word cloud, eh?
I'm not sure it'll speak for itself, but it'll be good. Okay, let's keep moving on. The third tip is about designing a stakeholder process. So Andrew had brought up a really good point that sometimes this is about informal settings, sometimes this is about formal settings. If you're going to be successful at engaging stakeholders, it's really important to think in advance about how you're going to do that. ideally, at the beginning of your research project, you have a plan for how you're going to engage your stakeholders. Because if you don't, what inevitably happens is you start to try to engage them at the end. And when you do that, you're mostly just telling them what you have found. And while that can be valuable, it might not be as valuable as if you were able to engage them early on and get their input. If you're engaging them early on, you're getting their buy-in, you're getting their ideas. They're much more, if they see themselves in the results and in the process, they're much more willing to actually think about and understand how to incorporate the results into the work that they're doing. So, as some tips on how to design an engagement process, think about who you want there. Once again, this sort of touches on the very first tip, but what's important to know is that when you're bringing a group of people together, that it's not only about what your relationship is like with each of those individuals, but what is the relationship and the dynamic of that group once you bring them together. So if you know two people in that group don't get along, you might not want to bring them to the table together. Or if you really need both of their opinions and you need them there, maybe you design ways of getting their feedback that don't necessarily encourage them to interact with one another too much. Or maybe you take a step back and your process involves some trust building and activities designed to build sort of that mutual respect. So that you have the relationships there and you're able to more quickly digest information, get ideas, and build support for ideas. If people aren't getting along, even if they do agree, consensus might be very difficult to achieve. So making sure that you have the right people in the room and thinking about the dynamic is really critical. Also thinking about the when. So when are you going to bring people together? Are you going to have regular meetings? Are you going to, ideally you had set up your calendar in advance so that people can get all of the dates in their calendar. And that's also just part of respecting people's time. If you give them a meeting notice a week ahead of time, that might not be enough time. And sometimes people become offended if you ask them for meetings without much notice. Depends. Different stakeholders want different things, and some people want to be more spontaneous. So you really have to get to know your stakeholder a little bit more. You also need to think about how you're going to try to seek feedback from people. So when you're designing your project, you need to think about that. So when do you want their input? Do you want, if you have an advisory committee, for instance, do you want them to provide input on what data sources there are? Maybe helping you define the scenarios that your modelers are going to run. Maybe your advisory committee can help make sure that the communications that are being developed make sense for stakeholders. You might want to get their early input on some of that. They can also help you get the word out. But depending on how you want their input, also helps inform when in the process you're going to get their input. And then also think about the resources that are required. So, do you need money? Do you need money in your budget to be able to support travel so that your advisory committee can come to you? Or do you need money in your budget to support your travel so that you can go see them? You need to plan those things out. And I think what I'm kind of saying across the board is that if you haven't planned for your stakeholder engagement process yet, it's going to be very difficult to incorporate that because, your budget might already have been set. Your sort of timelines might have already been set. But if you're going to truly do stakeholder engagement well, you need to be able to be flexible and incorporate that into your planning. So some of this is about what you might be able to, like in our Global Water Futures projects, some of you guys are already beyond some of this, where we already have our budget set. But I think there's opportunities. There's opportunities in the phase 2 of the project to redesign and rethink some of this. there's opportunities in the future projects that you guys are going to run. And I think there's also opportunities to see what kind of adaptation you can do kind of in the middle of the road. I'm going to pass this on to Andrew now.
Yeah, I'll take over for a while, Anthony. Thanks. Step 4 is engage in effective communication. And if you can see me, air quotes, effective communication. And Nancy and I kind of struggled a little bit with this, even with this definition. What is effective communication? And it really depends on who you're talking to and how you're talking to them, and which way that they're used to being talked to about some of this stuff. Where do they get their information? Who do they trust? What's effective? And that's really going to change depending on who you talk to. I work a lot with Indigenous communities in the Northwest Territories. What I communicate with them and how I communicate with them is very different than if I work with a government partner, in Ontario or something like that, right? So again, it's about knowing who your end user is and understanding how they want to be communicated with. And often there's more than one approach that's needed. Okay, sometimes the old telephone call is the best approach. Sometimes direct emails and communication, and that's great if that works and that's what your partner wants. But if you don't know, it's something you really got to figure out. And there's a lot of and as Nancy was saying, like how much is too much as well. If you're, understanding we're all busy and we all get 100,000 emails a day, is email of this information out to your partners, is that effective? We have to figure out a way, and through some of this planning that Nancy was mentioning, of how to make this timely and concise and really effective. Okay, and again, it really comes down to that relationship that you're building with people. What do they expect from us in terms of our outputs, in terms of our engagement, in terms of just kind of checking in? Some people really appreciate that, and others, are happy to wait until you've got the deliverable ready to be on their desk. And really, that's going to depend on a lot of different factors. If we have, I guess the next one, it was going to be another interactive poll. Is that working? We wanted this slide to be a little bit interactive and kind of place you guys at your desk, knowing that you get a lot of information coming your way. Think about things that really stand out in terms of what catches your eye. If you're getting, again, 100 million emails, what are the emails that catch your eye? What are the ways of people that are communicating with you that you find effective and that you really appreciate getting? Think about all the media that you are attached to, social media, webinars, whatever, and what speaks to you and kind of your personal experience of what effective communication is. And we'll see what comes up here. I really like how it changes shape as more information starts rolling in. So we're talking about information, and I'm really curious to name what that information is. Are you talking about that information that you have requested, or that kind of speaks to you, or is relevant to your, the information that fits into your wheelhouse? Immediately applicable. I like that one. A lot of personal has shown up a few times, and I do like happy. It's nice to get good emails that are fun and make you smile. Relevant information, there we go. Thank you for typing that in, everybody. Direct is pretty interesting. I like pictures, that's good. Language, and I'm hoping that's more, the kind of appropriate language and the level of language that you can digest, not overly complicated. Oh, there we are. Okay, poll is over. Thank you, everybody. I just wanted to highlight just some of the things that we've been doing through some of the projects that I'm associated with, just to kind of share what's going on across the network. And by no means is this best practice. Let's consider it a good practice. I think we all get the Global Water Futures newsletters, and this is the newsletter here from Sam's project in the north. Um, we can have a lot of conversations about, is that an effective way of communicating? And Nancy and I usually have a back and forth about this from time to time as well. It's interesting with the newsletter products that exist right now is you can actually get a lot of information from them. So we know through SAMs and um, other newsletters that maybe about 50% of people will open the letter or will open the email and click through it. And maybe I think it goes down to about maybe 20 to 30% of people will actually click on the stories and the links within inside that. And the question becomes, well, is that effective? And the answer is, well, sure it is. If you are happy to reach 20 people with this information, that's great. If that's not a mark of success for you, then maybe that answer is no, right? Sometimes the newsletter is part of a broader campaign. It works with things like social media. It works with more face-to-face meetings. Direct email contact. How do these things all work together? And it's just part of a plan. We're going to continue to develop newsletters because they provide content for a lot of interesting things. But again, is that effective? And it depends on who gets it, right? And a lot of people who maybe we don't reach out to on a daily basis, it's a good way of just sending them a lot of information about what's been happening, so they can digest it at their own pace to get up to speed on the project. Okay. I'm not sure how many projects have newsletters out there. I know of about 4 of them, I think. And it's an interesting question about whether or not those are useful or not. But in the context of some of these projects, they're going to continue with that because it's part of this overall strategy of engagement. I wanted to bring up social media just quickly. A lot of us use Twitter to communicate some of our research. It's a really good tool, especially for academics. We found for our community partners in the north, it's actually Facebook. So there's different ways. And maybe what we're saying here is that, communicating these results might not just be in one different way, but it might just be this kind of mixture of everything. And we found ways to actually use the newsletter to create the content, which we can use on social media so we can get better coverage. And a lot of us use workshops as well. And I think workshops are actually really great at kind of building that relationship and really kind of setting the stage for us to generate knowledge, right? So it's not just that one-way flow, but it's that multiple ways of understanding and flows of information that really kind of cement these relationships and can really do a lot to kind of move things forward. Again, just to kind of harp on my experience in the north, we do a lot of what's the word? We do a lot of translation, right? There are different indigenous languages we work with in the north, and some of our scientific terms do not work in any of the languages. So in order for us to kind of build that foundation of understanding, we simply go through terminology exercises to really kind of make sure that everyone is on the same page so we can work together. And we found that's a really another way of really building effective relationships moving forward. Next slide, enhancing participation. Okay, so I think we all talked about where we started on our curve there. We said like, well, we're somewhat participatory in what we do. So how do we move that? Like, how do we move the bar? Okay. And for some of us, we talk a lot about co-creation, and for many of the projects, that kind of co-creation horse has left the barn already because we're already boots on the ground doing science. But maybe what we should encourage is not to think of your project as a set in stone project, but one project under this envelope of many different projects that you can create as part of this with your partners. So you can always take the opportunity to co-create something new. It could be like a spin-off project. It could be a workshop or something engagement that isn't currently under your plan, your engagement plan, or your knowledge mobilization plan, but something that you can use with the information you're generating under your project and look for new opportunities. And that strengthens the relationship, because then you really push that kind of tangential project into that co-creation and really start developing that relationship much stronger with your partner. And something that came up in some of the chat here is consider co-authorship, not only in research papers, but just communications and outreach pieces, or summaries and discussion papers, right? There's a lot of things that we can do to really, I guess, hit the fact home that our partners are part of this process. And this relationship and this the research that we do together is a product of that. So instead of us doing the research, writing it up, and then sharing the results, maybe it's doing the research together, writing it up with some feedback and some mechanism of engaging our partners. And even that final piece becomes something that is done together. And it does mean a lot to partners. It's something I really kind of wanted to hit home with a couple of stories in the next couple of slides. In Northern Water Futures, the project, again, we have in the Northwest Territories. Full disclosure, that's where I do most of my work, so most of my stories are based up there. But part of the thing that our community members and our community partners really wanted is they wanted us to communicate science and engage communities and decision makers actually on the land. So we hold a lot of on-the-land camps and workshops with our community partners. Of course, it's really expensive to do that. So we've actually found ways of building these projects outside of the Northern Water Futures KM budget. So the KM budget, or the KM project, kind of builds that kernel, and we or plant that seed. Let's say that's even be a better analogy. And then we work with our partners to co-create these structures outside of that. So we're really still talking about the same fundamental research and the same issues, but together we go out and create these spaces to make sure knowledge mobilization happens in the way that communities find more appropriate. So to give another context, it would just be, developing programs with partners where those deliverables can fall outside of your project, and that's fine, right? I always figure Global Water Futures gives us a lot of resources to do a lot of great work, and we can use those resources to continue to build work, not just within the structure of the existing projects we have, but opportunities to explore ways outside of those projects to kind of continue to engage and to continue to do some great work. And finally, I wanted to bring up this experience I had with this Northern Public Affairs article. I got the opportunity to be a co-editor on this journal, and we used it to work with one of our partners that they were a new partner. And I guess reflecting on that, I don't think we had all the conversations that maybe we should have had with this partner around the research and the data and ownership and all that. And it actually was causing some friction within the relationship. Nothing major, but there was just some things we were running into because we really hadn't gone over a lot of the fundamentals of how this relationship was going to work. And it was really kind of impacting one of the students we had on the project. As part of this, we were able to get to the table and write an article together on this. And the article was just really kind of a background stuff, and it allowed us to kind of sit down and think about what we had been doing and think about where we wanted to go. And it really created this really strong understanding between the partners about where we were going together. Okay, it was that kind of, it gave us that reflective piece where we were able to really kind of understand where we were both coming from. That this research was owned by the community, and that we were providing maybe this bit of capacity or little sparks to kind of get them through some of the hurdles that they were going through. So this is where we've talked about some of this in the chat box there as well. Is it provides this really interesting opportunity when you actually go co-create these products, where you can have these conversations and create that space to really understand, again, what their needs are, where they're coming from, but really kind of how this relationship works and how this relationship can be bettered in the future, right? So it was, that's always my one story of that, of co-creating stuff. And of course, it doesn't have to be articles. It can be a lot of these, just outreach and education pieces that I think we really want to see more of as part of the Global Water Futures outreach material. But just consider that when you're doing some of this work with communities, that those products become actually very important in your engaging your end users. So tip 6 is the last one we got, and really it's be proactive. We're sharing a lot of information here with you, and some of it has to be on you guys, really, to kind of make up your own plans, to go out there and talk to people, and really train yourself. I think many of you might find that it's easy to do the research. Stats might be easy, people might be hard. And that's very true, right? Relationships can be complex. We all come from a different background. We all have different, needs and, in terms of what we want to get out of these research. And it's often really hard to navigate those, okay? And I guess what we're trying to say in this webinar, and maybe some of the other ones, is that there's a lot of tools that you can develop and that we can develop collectively, and how to share it and train ourselves and train each other to become, better researchers that are better at communicating and engaging, engaging our end users and engaging them in the whole process. Okay, and I think that was the spirit of the whole KM theme throughout all the CFRF projects, and all the Tri-Council funding is going in that direction as well. So it's a really good opportunity now to have these conversations about how to do this. And again, I'm not sure how many answers Nancy and I have provided you with you today, but it's part of that conversation is, well, we don't have all the answers, right? Part of this conversation is that it's going to be different for everybody. But part of the thing we wanted to do today, and as part of this kind of KM theme we want to have with everyone, is that we're all in this together and we can all help each other, right? So some of this can be, talk to your KM specialist. We work a lot here at Laurier, and I know Waterloo does some of this as well around HQP training on some of this communication work. We just did a whole 2-day workshop here at Laurier about how do you teach science to kids. You know what? There's tools available. There's training that we can deliver as part of this Global Water Futures initiative. But again, you guys being proactive about the skills you're interested in developing, talking to people who can help train you or deliver those skills, and really kind of bring a broader understanding of knowledge mobilization across the board. Okay, and this is really the vision of a lot of the KM stuff moving forward. But again, putting it on you guys, it's great to have you guys as part of this conversation as well.
Yep. So we're just wrapping up at this point. And just to reiterate what Andrew was sort of saying, is that this is hard stuff, and there is no direct answer. We can't say do this, this, and this, and then you're done. It's about muddling through to a degree. And if you're going to become learn to become better researchers that engage end users and stakeholders and partners throughout the entire process, if you're going to figure out how do we close that link between research and what's happening on the ground, we have to just keep trying. And I think I can speak on behalf of all of the KM team when I say that we don't have all of the answers, but we would love for you to knock on our door and set up a meeting and come and chat with us, have a half an hour long discussion, brainstorm some ideas. Sometimes it's difficult. Sometimes you have a challenge that you're not quite sure how to get through, who to talk to, or how do I approach someone, or how do I start to begin to develop a stakeholder engagement process. And what I'd say is that we are here to help personalize and individualize the strategies that you guys are working on. So while we're talking and giving you sort of general tips on this webinar, I would think that some of the greater value we can offer is in that one-on-one conversation. So please utilize us. That's what we're here for. And, I truly believe that if we are able to make better researchers, we're going to be able to solve these really great big water problems that are really threatening our water supply, water quality. So use us. If you guys have further tips that we missed, I encourage you to include those in the chat box. And then also, we just wanted to open this up for discussion. So here are some ideas of questions we were going to pose. But if you have other questions, if you have questions of clarification, if you have suggestions or stories you want to tell us, we're happy to open the floor to you. If you have a challenge that you're not quite sure how to address, we'd love to hear that as well. Just if you're facing that challenge, other people might be facing that challenge as well. It might be helpful to have a broader discussion about that. So you can either include some information in the chat box, type your questions there. Feel free to unmute yourself. There's lots of different options. Or, like I had said earlier, we're always open. You can phone us, send us an email, and we can talk about it later as well. In the meantime, while you're thinking about all of these questions, well, I'll just read the questions so that I'm taking up some time while you're considering what to ask. But what we're really interested in, what are the challenges that you've been experiencing as you're trying to engage with stakeholders? Are you I'm curious, are you finding it challenging to get responses from people? Are you finding it difficult to find out, which people to talk to in which organization? Have people been not very responsive? Sustaining the energy. I think that that's a really good question because some of these projects are quite long, and I was involved on the advisory committee of one project that was 3 years long, so quite a long time. And what they had done was they had planned out the stakeholder engagement plan, and every 6 months they touched base with us. And they did so once a year was in person, and then the alternative was a phone call, a webinar. So, and what they had done at the beginning of each of those meetings was recap where they're at, sort of like, quick, here's our process, quick, here's where we're at, quick, here's what we've heard from you last time, here's how we've incorporated your feedback, and now we're going to talk about this, and now we want your input on the next stage of our research. So that was really a great example of how they were able to involve us right from the beginning of sort of defining the questions all the way through to the end of the process, where we actually helped them define or strategize how do they communicate the results, which was really important because some of those results were really quite sensitive and different stakeholders might have interpreted them in different ways. So we were able to kind of say, don't use this word. Here are some specific groups you might want to give a heads up to. before you send that out to the media. Here are specific reporters that are going to be very sensitive to this issue and help you cover that more strategically. We were able to offer those types of advice that was really critical for the researchers, I think, and contributed to the overall success of the project. Andrew or even Stephanie Merrill, do you have any other tips or stories for how to sustain energy over time?
Yeah, a lot of the comments coming up are, sometimes there's that lull, and how do you reconnect? And I guess some questions back is really that depends on who it is, right? If it's a partner who just expects you to deliver the final output, what level of check-ins can you do? Like, can you hold these meetings of just updates, and is that appropriate to the project? For some people, if you come back to them and say like, well, we're not done yet, but what about here's where we are, and getting that feedback along the way can often be very valuable, because what you agreed on doing, a few years ago, which is really when we started developing a lot of these projects, might be different. So there was a comment there about that kind of that iterative process. So how can you update, get feedback, maybe even change some of the priorities of the project, and that's really going to depend on really is that acceptable to your end user, but you can use that as a way of potentially re-energizing the project, and really kind of tailoring that to the outcomes you want, right? Again, in academia, you write the grant, a year before you get the money, and sometimes they change. So how can you build that in? And if your project is flexible enough, and you have you have the team that's willing to kind of change course, then yeah, provide that space, right? Like a lot of this relationship building is providing that space for those conversations with your partner. So having an updated meeting, or having just having that check-in is always a good idea.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just add another idea. If you don't have, so one is like, just because you started your project doesn't necessarily mean you can't establish committees or regular meeting times, or thinking about other strategies such as a newsletter, or even just quick email communication on a regular basis. I mean, put in your calendar, a monthly reminder to say, send a quick email update. And quick email updates, the way that I think about it is that as long as you're not sending emails every week, if you're sending emails every month or every couple months, on a somewhat regular basis, I think people appreciate that. If you don't have an update to give, you could think about what are some of maybe you have questions for people, or finding different tactics. Sometimes the way that I've done this is depending on. It's very difficult to talk in generalization, but if I'm trying to maintain a relationship with someone and I don't necessarily have something to say yet, sometimes I just find a piece of information that I think that would be of interest to them, and I'll send them an article, or I'll send them, I don't know, like an invite to a workshop that came across my site that they might be interested in, just so they keep remembering my name and they see it in their emails. It's very helpful that way.
Yeah, and I guess we always have to remember that relationship building can also be a full-time job. And so maybe this kind of team approach we have to take to that inside our own projects. A good question about what if you miss somebody? Well, you're probably going to miss somebody, and I think it's when you do know that you miss somebody, you can reach out to that person and see, you know, it might be impossible to include them on the current project, but we're always looking for kind of new projects and new ways of engaging more partners. So maybe they're not integral to the project you currently have, but maybe the outcomes of that project are still relevant. And again, it's just, you know, taking the time to build that relationship to kind of see if that works. You know, a lot of the research that I do is with communities in the north, and I would say, you know, 75% of my time goes into kind of building those relationships and maintaining those relationships. It can be very intense, right? So, you know, it's really probably good to reflect on this within the projects where there are multiple people that can do some of the work in a coordinated effort to make sure we get kind of full coverage. I really like the idea of expanding out some of this as part of the science meeting. We're always looking to hold some really good KM sessions where we can do some of this conversation. For me, I find it very strange I'm talking at my computer. I would love to talk to you guys face to face about some of this stuff, and really kind of highlight some of these issues that you guys are having, because you're being very active on the chat here, and it seems like this is something that many people do struggle with and have challenges with. So it'd be really interesting to figure out how we can continue to support this conversation to help you through some of these things.
Yeah, I'm reading Anna Frank's question about how to coordinate different people's preferences regarding the way that they would like to be communicated with. So some people want formal communication, some informal, some like to keep it professional, some are more relaxed. I would actually suggest that we are trying different ways of communicating. Like we're emulating that the answer to that as a KM team. We're finding the same challenges, right? Some of our researchers want continuous communication. Some of them want to learn through webinars. Some of them want to sit down one-on-one. Some of them want workshops. And so we're just kind of throwing everything out. We're just trying, and we're seeing what works, and we're asking for feedback. So we're going to send out a survey monkey after this webinar and see what you guys thought, see if you have additional questions. There is no sort of, there's no great answer to that question other than to keep trying. And the more you start to know people, the easier it's going to be to remember how they like to have communication. And just like, you know, the other thing Andrew was saying, not everyone's going to read every newsletter, but it's just another tool that we're using in order to encourage that dialogue. And, you know, different tools are going to work better for different people. My personal preference is that if I'm going to build a relationship with someone, I really try whatever I can to at least have one in-person meeting early on, because I find that if you're able to sit down face to face with someone or at least do a video chat, then you can get to know people a little bit more. You establish a little bit of a rapport and a relationship, and then you can build from there. And emails are a little bit easier, and newsletters are a little bit more read. So some of this just takes a little practice. Some of this is about, you know, working through some process. Some of it's just about, what is the saying, like throwing mud at the wall and seeing what sticks.
Nancy, I just wanted to chime in too that I think that there are some formal mechanisms that you can put in place as well as the informal throwing things at the wall and see what sticks. You know, if you have a project that has identified your partners and your stakeholders, and you can kind of bring everybody together, there are things like co-creating a charter or terms of reference as a collective or a group, where everybody kind of has a chance to chime in on the expectations for how the project unfolds, the communication, the frequency of meetings and communication, and have the team kind of develop this together so that the conversation is had kind of with everybody in the room or on the webinar or the workshop, so that everybody's kind of on a similar page with expectations, and that also helps you deliver that over time. You can kind of look back to it and say, I see that you're unhappy with the way this is unfolding, but this is how we decided as a group. Maybe we should go back and revisit the process that we co-defined. It can help with some accountability with that two-way communication that came up in the chat box as well. That there is responsibility on your partners and your stakeholders to also contribute to the communication and the updates and their roles in the project. So I just wanted to offer that there are some tools around kind of formalizing that process a little bit more to help with accountability and liability if you feel like that's a concern. Sometimes it can be in certain situations if you're working with in industry groups or things like that. So and I think on our website, the KM tab, we have started to build a few of those resources. So also, we can help you develop your own terms of reference or charter for a project if you need something like that. I'm Stephanie, by the way.
Great.
There's been, I was going to say there's been a bit of a chatter about having specific webinars on some specific issues. If you want to be specific about those, include them in there, right? We want to make sure this is useful for you guys. So let us know. Let us know what you're interested in. We did have one on communication in New Year, I think. There's also an Indigenous engagement and KM session being planned at some point, but again, we have opportunities at the there's a meeting in January, which is for the core teams, and there's another meeting in May, which is the kind of annual meeting. So those are other times we can use some of this. Having a whole KM session about projects creating or presenting some of the KM things that they've created, and giving them those opportunities to share kind of how they went about that. If that's valuable to you, we should know that so we can transfer that message up the ladder to the people who are planning these things.
Yeah, and I think that I'm hearing you guys in terms of you wanting specifics. And one of the things that, just to be honest, one of the things that we've struggled with is how do we provide specific ideas and strategies that is applicable to a broad range of projects when the projects are so different and are working in different areas and are applying different strategies. And so I'm just, maybe we'll think about how can we maybe do some pre-surveys before the webinars to understand what are the questions that you have and what are some of the specific challenges that you're having so that we can specifically address those on the webinar. So perhaps we'll try some of those strategies just to see if we can really dig down and get the right information to you. That's always a challenge, and I think that's a broader challenge on this, providing webinars like this, but also just in general providing research, is how do you get the right information to the right people at the time when they actually need it. And so this is something we're trying to work through and trying to figure out. So we're happy to hear your ideas. Once again, I really encourage you to either just throw it in the chat box here if you have specific questions, or send it to us in the SurveyMonkey that we'll send out. If you have not registered to this webinar through the Eventbrite system, can you put your email address in the chat box so we make sure that we include you on the follow-up emails? And keep an eye out for further information as we provide that in email. So just so you know, here's the schedule. Like I had said, our next webinar is scheduled for February. I know that's far out. We may add an additional one in January, so just keep an eye out for that. And then another one March 15th, and then another one on April 1st. But you know, these are just the scheduled webinars. If you have additional questions, you know, feel free to send those to us at any time. And I just want to say a really big thank you. I want to say thank you to Stephanie Merrill. She has been our slide flipper. She managed all of the really interactive polls. Andrew and I were the ones to put the content together, so thank you very much, Andrew, for all of that work. Also, thank you to some of our PIs who joined. Sheridan and Mark Servos were on the line, so we really appreciate, and there might be other PIs from other universities. I'm sorry, I don't know if I don't know your names, but I really appreciate you joining. We think that it's really important to involve everyone on these types of conversations. And then finally, just thank you to everyone who is joining our webinars in general. We really appreciate that. Any other final thoughts from anyone? Andrew?
Nancy, it's Stephanie. I just wanted to point out that April 1st is a typo on that table. It's actually April 12th, so a 2 got left off of that.
Okay, thank you. Check the webinar. Check the website for the latest list of webinars. That's going to be your best resource.
Yeah, and feel I was gonna say, just feel free to reach out, guys. Okay, there seem to be a lot of questions and a lot of chat happening around. So we're very interested in continuing this conversation. Feel free to email us, and hopefully we can help you guys out. So thanks a lot. This was fun. Let's do it again soon.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.